The Way of Shadows by Brent Weeks, Chapter 43. The king fidgeted in his throne. It was a vast piece of ivory and horn inlaid with gold tracery, and it made him look a boy. The audience chamber was empty today, except for the regular guards, several guards hidden in the room's secret exits, and Durzo Blint. The emptiness made the chamber seem cavernous. Banners and tapestries adorned the walls, but did nothing to stave off the perpetual chill of such a large stone room. 7 pairs of pillars held the high ceiling, and 2 sets of 7 steps each led to the throne. Durzo stood quietly, waiting for the king to initiate the conversation. He already had a battle plan, if it came to that. It was a second nature to him. The Meister, standing by the king, would have to die first, then the 2 guards flanking the throne, then the king himself. With his talent, he could probably jump from the throne up to the passage above, currently obscured by a banner. He'd kill the archer within, and from there he'd be uncatchable. Like all battle plans, it would last only until the first move, but it was always useful to have a general plan, especially when you had no idea what your enemies knew. Durzo felt himself reaching into his garlic pouch, but he forced his hand to be still. Now was no time to show nerves. It was harder to stop his hand than he would have guessed. Something about the bite of garlic was comforting when he was stressed. "You let my boy die," the king said, rising. "They killed my boy last night, and you did nothing." "I'm not a bodyguard." The king grabbed a spear from the guard standing beside him and threw it. Durzo was surprised at how good a throw it was. Had he stood still, the spear would have caught him in the sternum. But of course he didn't stand still. He swayed to the side, not even moving his feet, with careless and, he hoped, infuriating ease. The spear bounced off the floor and then hissed as wood and steel slid across stone. There was a rattle of armor and the whisper of arrows being drawn back all around the room, but the guards didn't attack. "You're not shit unless I say so," the king said. He strode forward, coming down his double flight of 7 steps to stand in front of Durzo. Tactically, a poor move. He was now blocking at least 3 of the archer's shots. You're shit! You're shitting shit!" "Your Majesty," Durzo said gravely, "a man of your stature's cursing vocabulary ought to extend beyond a tedious reiteration of the excreta that fills the void between his ears." The king looked momentarily confused. The guards looked at each other aghast. The king saw the look and realized from their expression that he'd been insulted. He backhanded Durzo, and Durzo let the blow fall. Any quick motion now, and a nervous archer might loose his arrow. The king wore rings on all his fingers, and 2 of them carved furrows in Durzo's cheek. Durzo clenched his jaw to quell the rising black fury. He breathed once, twice. He said, "The only reason you're alive right now isn't that I'm not willing to trade my life for yours, Aileen. I'd hate to be killed by amateurs, but know this, if you ever lay a hand on me again, you'll be dead less than a second later. Your Majesty." King Aileen Gundur IX lifted his hand, seriously contemplating becoming the late King Aileen Gundur IX. He lowered his hand, but a triumphant gleam filled his eyes. "I won't have you killed yet, Durzo. I won't have you killed because I have something better than death for you. You see, I know about you, Durzo Blint. I know. You have a secret, and I know it." "Forgive me for quaking. "You have an apprentice, a young man styling himself as a noble, Kyler something or other, a young man staying with those holier-than-thou drakes. Quite a student of the sword, isn't he, Master Thule?" A chill shot down Durzo's spine. Night angels have mercy. They knew. It was bad, worse than bad. If they knew Kyler was his apprentice, it couldn't be long before they pinned the prince's death on him, especially with the spectacle Kyler had made of himself by fighting with Logan Geyer. If Durzo's apprentice had been involved with killing the prince, the king would assume he had done it with Durzo's approval, if not under his orders. Roth would not be pleased. The garlic crunched in his mouth, giving a soothing jolt to his senses. He took a breath and willed himself to relax. How had they done it? Master Thule? Damn it, anything could go wrong, and something will. Durzo hadn't been betrayed. There was no grand scheme. The name meant that one of the king's spies had been watching the Drakes. Probably just routine spying on a formerly powerful man. The spy had seen Durzo enter and had recognized him. Probably the spy had been one of the guards the king had tried to awe him with in the statue garden. It didn't matter. "Oh, I wish Brent were here right now to see the look on your face, Durzo Blint. In fact, where is Brent?" the king asked Chamberlain. Sire, he's in the castle now, on his way here to report. He went to the Geyer estate after investigating matters at the Jadwin estate. Durzo's throat tightened. Aegon would have put the pieces together about Kyler. If he came in while Durzo was still here, Durzo would die. The king shrugged. His loss. At the word, grief and fury rippled through the little king, and he seemed abruptly a different man. You let them kill my boy. Shit. So I'm going to kill yours. His death will come from the last hand he'd expect, and it will be arriving, any minute now. I heard you had a little tussle with Logan last night, Count Drake said. Kyler blinked through blurry eyes and went from dead tired to wide awake in the space of a second. He'd only slept for a few hours, and he'd had the nightmare again. Every death he saw made him dream of rats. They were seated at the breakfast table, and Kyler had a forkful of eggs poised in front of his mouth. He stuffed it in to give himself a little time. Mitwup Niffin, he said. This was a disaster. If Count Drake knew about the fight, he might know about the prince's death. Kyler had thought that he'd have time to pack his things and leave this morning before the Drakes got word. That he needed to leave was undeniable. He just thought he'd have a little more time. Sarah was quite upset, the Count said. She took Logan to her aunt's house near the Jadwins to have his wounds tended. She just got back a few minutes ago. Oh, Kyler chewed more eggs mechanically. If Sarah had left right after the fight, she and Count Drake didn't know about the prince yet. Apparently, Kyler's perfect streak of bad luck was breaking. But now that he knew the matters of life and death weren't threatening him, he realized that Sarah coming home and telling Count Drake what had happened last night would have other implications. I gave Logan my permission to propose to her yesterday. You knew that, didn't you? That would be the Count's gentle way of saying, why the hell did you kiss my Sarah and beat up my future son-in-law and your best friend after you told me you had no feelings for her? Out of the corner of his eye, Kyler saw someone pass the window quickly, and a moment later, the old porter toddled around after, looking upset. The front door banged open. A moment later, the door to the dining room slammed open with such force that the dishes on the table rattled. My lord, the porter protested. Logan stormed into the room, red-eyed but regal. He held a claymore the size of Alitaria in his hand. Kyler jumped to his feet, sending his chair crashing into the wall. He was pinned in a corner. Count Drake was rising, shouting something, but he was too slow. Nothing could stop Logan now. Logan hefted the claymore. Kyler hefted a butter knife. I'm engaged, Logan shouted. He swept Kyler into a massive hug. By the time Logan released him, Kyler's heart had started beating again. Count Drake collapsed into his chair in relief. You big bastard, Kyler said. Congratulations. I told you it would work, didn't I? Work? Count Drake asked, recovering his voice. Logan plowed forward, ignoring the Count. Well, you didn't have to hit me so hard. Well, I had to convince her, Kyler said. You nearly widowed her. I haven't been beaten so badly since the fight in the arena. Excuse me, the Count said. Work? Convince her? They stopped and looked at the Count guiltily. Well, Logan said, Kyler said Sarah really did love me, and she only needed to be reminded, and he trailed off. Kyler, are you telling me your fight was staged? You made a fool of yourself in public, deceived my daughter, and traded her affections like a cheap trinket? That's not exactly. He couldn't match the Count's stare. Yes, sir. And you dragged Logan into this? Logan, who ought to know better? The Count asked. Yes, sir, Kyler said. At least Logan was looking as pained as he felt. The Count looked from one to the other of them, then broke into a grin. God bless you, he said, sweeping Kyler into a hug. After he released Kyler, Count Drake turned. There were tears in his eyes as he gripped Logan's forearms. And God bless you, son. Lord General Aegon stormed into the castle, flanked by his bodyguards. The day had already been long, and the sun had only been up 3 hours. Seeing the look on his face, the men guarding doors in the castle made sure he didn't have to wait for them to open. Servants quickly disappeared out of the halls. Walking into the audience chamber, he passed a cloaked man coming out who seemed vaguely familiar. But the man had his hood up and his face was invisible. One of the king's spies, no doubt. Aegon didn't have time for him. None of the news was good. The Geyers were the foremost family in the realm. To have their murder come on the same night the prince was killed was too much to bear. Aegon had liked the prince, but the Geyers had been his friends. And what he'd seen at their estate, he wouldn't wish on his worst enemy. The pieces weren't fitting. This had all the marks of a move, a big move. A play for the throne. But why this way? Killing the prince shook everything, of course, but killing the Geyer's servants and Lady Geyer did nothing politically, did it? As of today, his birthday, Logan Geyer became the Geyer in his father's absence. If you wanted to wipe out a family, you started with the heirs, not everyone else. and unless the news was still en route, both Geyer heirs were still alive. The prince's death wasn't only a terrible blow to the Gunder line, it was an enormous scandal. The king's affairs had been ignored, but finding the prince dead after apparently having relations with the king's mistress would shed all sorts of unflattering light on the entire Gunder line. The assassination, if it were such, wasn't just a tragedy, it was a horror and an embarrassment. The Lord General wondered whether the horror or the embarrassment would be foremost on the king's mind. What would the queen do? He approached the throne and climbed the stairs. The usual men were there, talking with the king. Aegon trusted none of them. "Out!" he roared. "All of you out!" "Excuse me," Fergund Safasti said, "but as the king's chief—" "Out!" Aegon bellowed in his face. The mage shrank and joined the men streaming out of the room. Aegon motioned to his bodyguards to step outside, too. The king didn't even look up. At length he said, "I'm ruined, Brent. What will history say about me?" "That you're weak, ineffectual, selfish, and amoral. Sire, we have more pressing matters." "Everyone's talking about it, Brent. My son. She murdered my boy." The king started weeping. "So the man is capable of thinking of others. If only he'd shown his humanity more often." "Your Highness, the Duchess didn't kill your son." "What?" The king looked up at Aegon through blurry eyes. "Sire, it was a wet boy." "I don't care who actually did it, Brent. Trudana was behind it. Trudana and Logan Geyer." "Logan Geyer? What are you talking about?" "You think you're the only person I have working on this, Brent? My spies have already told me Logan was behind it all. That bitch Trudana just cooperated. I've already sent men to arrest him." Aegon reeled. It couldn't be. In fact, he was sure it wasn't. "Why would Logan do such a thing?" he asked. "Logan was one of your son's best friends. He isn't ambitious in the least. By the gods, he just got engaged to Sarah Drake, a count's daughter." "Didn't have anything to do with power or ambition, Brand. It was jealousy. Logan felt that my son had totally humiliated him over some trivial matter. You know how boys get. It's just like the Geyers, to covet our every success. Besides, I have witnesses who heard Logan threaten him." It was all rattling together, the pieces spinning and falling into place. Kyler Stern, the false noble, the wet boy, was a close friend of Logan's. In a fit of rage, Logan hired Kyler to kill the prince. It all fit, except that it was Logan. Aegon knew him, and he didn't believe it. "Which wet boy did they hire, Brent?" the king asked. "It was Kyler Stern," Aegon said. The king snorted. "Huh. The gods must be with me for once. Sire, I just hired Hugh Gibbet's apprentice to kill him. A girl wet boy, if you can believe it. Kyler is Blent's apprentice, or was. He's probably dead by now." "Kyler is Blent's apprentice?" The picture that had been slowly spinning together burst apart. The king had hired Blent. Blent's apprentice wouldn't have killed his employer's son, would he? The name Hugh Gibbet had been carved on the bodies at the Geyer estate. Of course, only a fool would carve his own name onto such a massacre. But from his hours at the estate, Aegon was sure that all the murders had been the work of a single man. He could think of no one who could kill so many people except a wet boy, and the style certainly fit what he'd heard of Hugh Gibbet. He couldn't imagine Durzo Blent mutilating bodies. Blent would consider it unprofessional. Hugh Gibbet would only sign his name if he thought the authorities would never have a chance to come after him. The king said the prince's murder didn't have anything to do with power. But this was Cennaria. Everything had to do with power. If Durzo Blent's apprentice really had killed the prince, why would he have left a witness? Blent's apprentice would be as professional as Blent himself. A witness was a loose end that was easy to tie up. It was all about power. Aegon scowled. "Has there been any word from our garrison at Screaming Winds?" "No." "So the Caledonian army is at least 4 days away. What are you planning to do about the festival tonight?" "I'm not going to celebrate Midsummers on the day after my son's death." The Lord General had a sinking feeling. "My king, I think perhaps you should." "I will not host a party for my boy's murderers." The king's eyes flashed, and he looked less like a petulant child and more like a king than Aegon had ever seen. "I have to do something," the king said. "Everyone will think—" He went on, but Aegon ignored him. "Everyone will think." That was the key. What will everyone think? The prince was dead, killed in a shameful way, either by the king's mistress or by a wet boy. The beloved Geyers were dead or imprisoned. Aegon suspected now that an assassin had probably made his way into Screaming Winds and killed Regnus as well. It wouldn't make sense to leave him alive, not when someone was going to such pains to set plans in motion. Everyone will think that the king ordered his own son killed in a jealous rage, and that to get back at his unfaithful mistress he framed her. With the right rumors, everyone's bewilderment over why the Geyers had been murdered could be turned to People would connect all the murders, but how? The Gyres were the next in line for the throne after the Gunders. Though the family had never challenged the king, weak and jealous, could be portrayed as paranoid all too easily, and the Gyres were far more respected than the Gunders. Lord Gyre's faithful service would be seen as being rewarded with treachery and murder. Logan, the new Lord Gyre, had been seized by the king, and the king's natural inclination would be to keep him in prison. But Logan was known to be absolutely moral, without ambitions. For the gods' sakes, he was betrothed to a lowly drake. So if the king were to die, who would succeed him? The vastly popular Logan Gyre would be in prison, where he could easily be killed. The king's son was dead, his eldest daughter was 15, the others were younger, too young to hold the throne in a nation at war. His wife Nalia might try to take the throne, but the king had feared her and marginalized her as much as he could, and she seemed content to stay out of politics. The Dadwins were finished after their part in the scandal. That left the kingdom's two other duchies. Either Duke Grayson or Duke Westeros, the queen's father, could make a grab for power. But the queen's brother, Havrin, was out of the country, so he seemed an unlikely usurper. Duke Grayson was feeble. Any of the dozen lesser families might try for the throne, but no one could hold it. It would be a civil war in which the four main parties were equally matched. Civil war of a kind far worse than the civil war that Regnus had feared 10 years ago when he allowed Eileen to take the throne. Where did that leave the other players he'd been worried about so much recently? Where did the Sakage and Calidor fit? If the price were right, Calidor could buy the Sakage's help. And then all the pieces snapped together for him at once. Lord General Aegon swore loudly. He cursed so rarely that the king stopped in mid-sentence. Eileen looked at Aegon's face, and whatever he read there made him afraid. "What is it? What is it, Brent?" All these years he and the king had been so focused on Calidor that they'd never thought of a threat coming from within. Calidor was taking out the entire line of succession and manipulating the king into helping. Once all the heirs who were both legitimate and powerful were eliminated, Calidor would kill the king. They would act quickly before he could establish a new line of succession, before he could consolidate power or mend the relationships he was about to break. Then they would watch the chaos and march when they pleased. "Your Highness, you must listen. This is the prelude to a coup. We may only have days. If it starts, all our preparations against Calidor will be useless, and you'll be the first to die." The king's face was pained with fear. "I'm listening," he said.